A key source of minor conflicts around my household is the fact that I don't trust testimony very far. I won't say I don't trust it at all, because sometimes you have to trust it. Sometimes you have to make a choice. Every choice you make is based on incomplete information. And when the time comes that you have to make a choice, you just have to make it. Whatever the quality of the information you have is. But I typically don't trust testimony. I don't trust the things that people say, not because I think that they're deliberately deceptive. One of the ways that I've caused conflict in my home, which is just me and Kathleen and 6 or 7 cats plus Dusty the dog. Who knows how many undetected insects and, of course, billions of microorganisms, but it's really just me and Kathleen. We're the only ones who can talk. But I have to, one of the ways I get to be more careful about the language that I use in my own presentations, whether or not I consider them testimony, but in my own presentations, I get more careful about language because of the hang-ups, the difficulties, the snags I run into with Kathleen. And so it's not a big deal for me to say every map is a lie, every word is a lie. But I don't mean deliberately deceptive, and that's what people typically mean by lies. And so I've had to revise my language slightly in order to avoid having the same quarrel over and over again. Instead of saying every word is a lie, I would just say that every word is misleading. Every map is misleading. And I've talked about this before, that a map ideally is as close as possible to being perfectly correspondent to reality, and yet nevertheless it cannot be perfectly correspondent to reality without being reality itself, without no longer being a map and simply being the territory. That every map omits almost everything of reality in order to embellish the particular details that are of importance to the map maker. And in consequence, the map is necessarily misleading. It may show you where every McDonald's is on the circumferential freeway surrounding Houston, but it won't tell you anything about the Taco Cabanas, which is what I would be interested in if I were in Houston. To hell with McDonald's. Let's go to Taco Cabana. Have chicken quesadillas and una más cerveza, por favor. Every bit of human testimony is misleading in that way without any intent to mislead. We're not accusing the map maker of being corrupt or evil or deliberately deceptive or manipulative or any sort of nefarious purpose. We're just acknowledging that to make a map is necessarily to omit details that may be important to the buyer and to embellish other details that may be of no importance whatever to the buyer. And that therefore the map is necessarily misleading because it is not the territory. The map is not the territory. But there's more to it than this in my mistrust of testimony, and that's another phrase that I use all the time that causes conflict, and this one I will not back off of because I recognize the truth of it, and that would be the admonition that stories always improve. Stories always improve. And so when someone tells you about something that just happened, this is the map that is most likely to be closely or more closely correspondent to the truth. And the more time passes between the event and the retelling of the story, the more that story will have improved. And there's a simple reason for this, and that is that what makes a story is the embellished and omitted details. That's what makes it a story. I've written hundreds of stories in my life. I've certainly crafted many more verbally. I sit here every Sunday and tell you fascinating stories about the world at large, all of which are improved. Doesn't mean deceptive, doesn't mean lying, doesn't mean evil, doesn't mean venal, vile, corrupt. It simply means that what makes the story interesting is what is most likely to make it misleading. And when someone tells me a story, generally speaking, I discount it automatically. I don't care for the first place. I really don't care, except in the sense of making conversation and being amused, being entertained. But if I have to rely on that story, if I can, I want to verify it myself. I want to validate what it is that I'm being told. And if I have to rely on that testimony in order to make a decision right now, then I recognize that I'm making a decision on the basis of suspect evidence. It may in fact be reasonably correspondent to reality, and I'm not making a mistake, but I have no way of knowing one way or another whether I am or not, because I haven't validated that map independently. I haven't compared it to the territory to find out what was omitted and what was embellished, and to find out if those omitted and embellished details matter to me, because all consciousness is local. And correspondingly, accordingly, the choice that I make and the tale that I tell about it afterward will necessarily be misleading also, and will necessarily be improved also. I'm not claiming some mantle of veracity that applies only to me. I am alike unto you as a human being, and I am as prone to error and as prone to making my stories more entertaining and less factually correspondent. The idea of news. I simultaneously pay a lot of attention to news and discount it all. News is a map of unreality. This is necessarily the nature of news, that what you were taught, if you ever took a journalism class, or you probably heard this, even if you haven't, when dog bites man, that's not news. When man bites dog, that is news. Well, why is it news when man bites dog? Because it's rare. What's interesting about rare things? The rareness of them. What does that imply about reality as such? What do we actually know about reality as such based on our day-to-day experience? That it's not rare, it's common. News is about outliers. I discount all outliers. I'm simply not interested in outliers. The world is full of clipboard clasping academics who love to go around cataloging outliers, and if you care about that stuff, you can pursue their work. I don't care about it at all. The 1 in 20, 1 in 50, 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, 1 in a million, these are not interesting to me at all. I'm interested in the middle of the bell curve, the stuff that always happens, not the stuff that never happens or almost never happens. I'm interested in the stuff that always happens, because the stuff that always happens is reality. That's what reality is the stuff that happens all the time. And the stuff that almost never happens is simply anomalous, and typically is not even very interesting as an anomaly, because there's some extra special, extraordinary circumstance that resulted in that anomaly that will not be repeated anytime soon. It's not worthwhile. I mean, obviously you can make a lot of money sitting around waiting for earthquakes to happen, but it's a pretty boring job because earthquakes almost never happen. And if you spend all your time living in fear of earthquakes and being obsessively prepared for the very next earthquake, or being obsessively prepared for the big one, you're wasting your time, you're wasting your money, you're wasting your life, because this is not going to happen. Being prudent and reasonably cautious, being reasonably well prepared for outlier events, that makes a certain kind of sense. But being obsessively prepared for things that almost never happens is almost certain to be a waste of your life, because your life will end before that event happens. To be prepared for a 100-year flood makes a certain kind of sense. To be prepared for a 500-year flood makes a lot less sense. To be prepared for a 1,000-year flood makes no sense. You're not going to live 1,000 years. If a 1,000-year flood comes along, you're not going to be prepared anyway. No matter how well you say you're prepared, you're not going to be prepared. What you need to be prepared for is getting to work on time tomorrow and getting the job done and making sure that your boss is satisfied with your work. Because this is the stuff that almost certainly is guaranteed to happen tomorrow, whereas the 1,000-year flood is almost certainly guaranteed not to happen tomorrow. But we like to obsess about outliers because it absolves us of the day-to-day responsibility of normal life. The stuff that we screw up all the time, we can excuse ourselves for screwing up because it's desperately important to attend to outlier events anyway, especially outlier events far, far away affecting people who have nothing to do with us, people we don't know, we'll never know, and we'll never have any experience with. These are the important things to consider. These are the kind of attitudes that make me so popular. Vast audience of the Church of Splendor, numbering in dozens every week. I'm grateful to the people who do listen to me, and I hope they reap some value from my particular perspective, especially on the subject of outliers. But if you want to get a whole lot of attention in the world of media, what you need to do is shriek hysterically about things that will never happen to you and blame all the things that really do happen to you on other people rather than yourself, because the only person who is fundamentally responsible for the things that happen to you is yourself, and certainly the only person who can correct the things that go wrong in your life is yourself. And therefore, if I can come up with elaborate rationales why your faults and mishaps are not your responsibility and why they're not yours to correct, then this is a way to get you to love me, which may explain why my audience numbers in dozens rather than dozens of millions. Another important thing to consider when you are taking account of news and popular media generally is to stop to consider who writes and why. Who is it who creates popular media and why do they do it? One of the reasons I don't trust testimony is that the thing that made me suck in the breath necessary to issue that testimony, there's a motive behind my testimony. And if I don't know what the motive is, if you don't know what my motive is, for instance, if I don't know what your motive is, then I really don't know what it is that you're saying, what it is that you're telling me. I just know that you're making sounds. People who write, all popular media is created by writers. Another one that gets me in trouble all the time is Kathleen watching a movie will say, well, why did that happen? And my answer is always the same. It's screenwriters. That's why it happened. Why did this happen this way and not some other way? Because the screenwriter wanted it to happen that way. Who writes screenplays? Who writes novels? Who writes news articles? Who writes poetry? Who writes songs? Who writes everything? Typically, almost always INTJs. And certainly almost always introverts, INTXs anyway, but introverts always, almost always. The people who write consistently and voluminously are almost always cautious, in the cautious temperament. You will find some incandescents, you will find some sociables. Driven people almost never write, and if they do, they write for driven purposes. So you'll find someone like Gaius Julius Caesar, we call him Caesar, wrote De Bella Gallico, wrote Bellum Cavile, the Civil Wars. He wrote them as propaganda. They're good books. They're good in English and they're good in Latin. They're fun to read. If you have contempt for Marcus Tullius Cicero, as I do, the person we call Cicero, you can read about his brother, Quintus Tullius Cicero, who was a great hero, as recorded by Caesar in De Bella Gallico. But Caesar wrote the books that he wrote as propaganda. Very driven man, but he was writing for very driven purposes. He wasn't writing for the benefit of the reader. He was writing for the benefit of Caesar. And this is something you should presume when you're absorbing any kind of published popular media, books, newspapers, CDs, television, movies, etc. You should presume that the writer is writing for his benefit and not for yours. The driven will always do that, but the cautious are doing it too. And it's interesting to take account of the art of romance, the art of who should fall in love with whom, because that art is almost always written by people that I would call beta losers. And the subject of the material is why girls should not fall for alpha winners. This is the subject. And now take that as a lens and go watch romantic comedies on Netflix, or go read romantic stories, or just sort through your memories of things that art you've consumed in the past, and look at it from that point of view, that here's the bookish, intellectual, writerly writer who is naming all the reasons why the active, athletic, warlike alpha is not the ideal mate for the pretty girl in the story, why the bookish beta loser is the ideal mate instead. But this is who produces popular media, is people who feel one down, typically. People who feel themselves to be one down in the game of life and don't like it that they're in this one down position, and are looking for a way to turn the tables on the people who they perceive as being one up. The subject of our homily today is, what about Jackie? I don't know Jackie's last name, and I don't really want to. I know more about Jackie than I want to, and I haven't read any of the original source material. I'm talking about the Jackie who was the subject of the so-called rape culture article in Rolling Stone published around Thanksgiving, and which fell apart this week. The story fell apart completely this week. The writer of that particular story went out of her way to shop for what she thought would be the worst possible example of so-called rape culture, and struck pay dirt at the University of Virginia with Jackie, who told her exactly the story that she wanted to tell in Rolling Stone. Story of a brutal gang rape as a part of a fraternity initiation. That poor Jackie allegedly was raped in the company of 9 men, raped by 7 of them, thrown brutally onto a glass table which shattered when she landed on it, and then for hours on end was raped brutally by these 7 guys on top of all this broken glass. This by itself is completely implausible. What we're talking about is a brutal, vicious crime that, if it actually happened, and I can't say if it did or didn't, but if it actually happened, the natural course of action for Jackie when she was finally released from this torture would have been to go to a hospital or to go to the police, and she did neither of these things. Had she been raped for hours on end on broken glass, she would certainly have a whole lot of broken glass in her body, which would have had to have been removed and which would have left scars. All of this is independently verifiable, regardless of anything else you might do to verify this story. The first thing that any thoughtful person would say on hearing a story like this is, oh, how interesting, show me your scars. When people talk to me about spousal abuse, I always want to see the police reports, the hospital reports. That particular story is one you'll hear a lot when marriages are falling apart, about the abusive spouse, male or female. 50% of all actual marital violence is committed by women against men. One of those truths we never want to tell ourselves, preferring to tell ourselves lies about brutal men and helpless women. But 50% of all actual marital violence is committed by women, and they're much more likely to use weapons than men are. So the actual damage that occurs as a result of marital violence is more likely to be inflicted by women than by men. But if you want to tell me that there was violence in your marriage, I want to see the police reports. I want to see the hospital reports. And in the same respect, if you tell me about rape, I want to see the rape kit. I want to hear about the rape kit anyway. I want to hear about what happened at the hospital and what happened at the police station. Because if you didn't go to the hospital and you didn't go to the police station, then you yourself do not believe you were raped. Not at the time. You might insist later that you were, and that's the case with Jackie. She was telling a story to Rolling Stone about events that allegedly occurred 2 years ago. Not yesterday, 2 years ago. Again, remember, stories always improve, and they always improve over time. The more recent in time the event is, to the retelling of the story, the more likely it is to be ontologically correspondent to real, discernible, independently verifiable facts. And the farther removed it is in time, the more likely it is to have improved. And that certainly is the case with Jackie, that when she first started telling this story about this gang rape, it involved oral sex. No other way to say it. An oral gang rape, which again is completely implausible. And an oral gang rape involving 5 guys, not 7. And suddenly it turned into a brutal vaginal rape involving 7 guys and a beer bottle and a glass table. If we had waited another 2 years, we might have had the entire marching band of the University of Virginia involved. But the story certainly has improved over time. And the question would be, assuming the story has improved, why has it improved? And remember, who writes and why? Who tells stories and why do they tell stories? They tell stories because they're one down and they want to be one up. And that gets us into this whole idea of rape culture, which is has a corresponding form in the idea of jock culture, frat culture, etc. It's all about other culture. And if you are among the one down population in a big group, it is certainly natural for you to, or expectable anyway, anticipatable that you will envy the one-up cohort, and you will find ways of telling stories about the one-ups that make them look bad in comparison to you. This is not rare, it's common. If you are a freshman on a big university campus, you are basically nobody. You are away from home for the very first time in your life. You don't know anybody, and you don't stand out in any way at all. The people who stand out are going to be the upperclassmen because they've been around, they've put in the time, they've gotten the reputation for outstanding behavior, whether it's good behavior or bad behavior. Reputations take time to develop. People have to get to know you in order to determine who you are and what you can do. And if you're a freshman and you don't stand out and you want to, how do you go about doing it? Well, if you are really exemplary in what you can do and how you do it, you're going to stand out anyway, and that's a great thing. But suppose you're not. I call it the victimhood express, and this is very much a part of our pop culture right now. Really, there's no way to get much attention for your achievements unless they are so off the charts amazing that people cannot forbear to pay attention to you. And if you really want to stand out in a crowd like that where you have nothing to call attention to yourself, then claiming to have been victimized is a great way to do it. And I'm not accusing Jackie of this because I have no idea what happened, what she did, why she did it. But it is a very common phenomenon, especially on college campuses, the faked hate crime, that the victim of the so-called hate crime turns out to have faked all the evidence. Sad to say, almost always herself. This is not as common among men. I won't insist that it doesn't happen among men, but it seems to be women who do this a lot more often than men who do it. And this easily could explain Jackie's story. It's exactly the sort of thing that any sort of rational, skeptical person would entertain that skepticism right away. I'm hearing a really remarkably unbelievable story, a story about a massive, vicious conspiracy, not just a crime, but a criminal conspiracy, and allegedly an ongoing criminal conspiracy, because this allegedly was the common practice for pledging new members of this particular fraternity, was the ritual gang rape that had to take place in front of a room full of people. How could this not have been discovered before? How could it not have been reported before? That the simple fact of a brutal gang rape, whether or not the girl wants to go to the hospital, she could easily end up in the hospital anyway. She could easily end up unconscious or dead. How do you keep the police and the hospital, the emergency room, out of this? It's completely implausible that they would be out of it, but one incident, if you want to insist in the case of this one incident that the hospital and the police were not involved, this is the kind of thing that could happen. Oh, it could happen. This is one of the things that people always say when you doubt testimony. Oh, it could happen. Well, yeah, of course, anything could happen, but what almost always does happen is what almost always does happen. And if you have an ongoing ritual, criminal conspiracy involving the brutal gang rape of college freshmen, pretty little white college freshman girls, it is completely implausible that this could go on for years on end without the police knowing about it, without the emergency room having some evidence that it had occurred. And so as much as you want to say it could happen, I want to say 1 out of 1,000,000 it could happen, 1 out of 1,000 it could happen. Every year it could not happen. I don't believe it. But we have an underfathered mob of children out there, men and women. Now, I'm not picking on women because all of our children are underfathered. Everybody alive in the Western world, with almost no exceptions, is underfathered. And the more underfathered children are, the more you're going to see acting out, attention-seeking behavior, that boys will become class clowns or vandals or gangbangers or jocks, attempting to manifest a masculinity that they don't really feel. And girls will do things like cut themselves, get bizarre piercings or tattoos, or make bogus rape claims as a way of drawing attention to themselves, as a way of getting the attention that they don't feel that they can earn, but nevertheless desperately want. That's tragic. That's the real tragedy. I don't want to malign Jackie in any way at all, because as far as I'm concerned, Jackie's rape really started with the publication of that article, not whatever happened in September or October of 2012 may have been everything she described, may have been something less, may have been nothing, whatever, nothing but the product of her imagination. I have no way of knowing that, and neither do you, and neither does anyone else. Some of these details are subject to verification. Unfortunately, every detail that has been investigated so far has turned against Jackie. It doesn't mean she's lying. It argues that she is embellishing in one way or another, but the reality of her life is that she desperately wanted attention so bad that she brought down a thunderstorm of attention on herself, first in the form of this positive pity for her awful plight, and now in a reign of condemnation for her putative presumed deception. All of which is conjectural. Both houses are conjecture. On the one hand, we have the people who hate fraternities and jocks deciding that Jackie must be telling the truth, and there are people in the Sunday newspapers today, there are people insisting that facts don't matter because rape culture, jock culture, we got to do something. Facts don't matter. And on the other hand, we have people who, for good or ill, want to dismiss all of these claims, again, without considering any sort of evidence. I truly don't know what happened to Jackie in 2012. I have a pretty good idea what happened to Jackie in 2000 or 2001. That's when she was underfathered. That's when her underfathering really started, when she was 4 or 5 years old. I haven't met her. I don't know her. I could be wrong. I don't believe I am, because we live in an underfathered culture, and we are seeing exactly the kind of behavior that we expect from underfathered children. Exactly the kind of behavior that we expect from underfathered children. She didn't get the attention she needed from her father. She's never gotten the attention she needed from her father. Her father probably never got the attention he needed from his father. Repeat after me. But she arrived on the campus of the University of Virginia with some great big underfathered need. If this made her a victim of some kind of rape, or simply just less than perfectly ideal sex, this would be evidence of her underfathered status also. But the improvement of her story, whatever the original story was, if anything, the improvement of that story, the successive improvements to that story over time, and then the retailing of that story to Rolling Stone, to a perfectly willingly credulous, again, undoubtedly underfathered writer. These are all the kind of attention-seeking behaviors that we associate with underfathered children. This will plausibly get quite a bit worse before it gets better, because we live in an underfathered culture. But I, unlike everyone else, I guess, I feel a kind of a sadness, a sorrow for Jackie, because her life is going to get a lot worse before it gets better. It'll take her a long time to get away from this. And the people who are paying attention to her are all paying attention to her for their own reasons and not for hers. Her mother and her father, brothers and sisters, grandparents, aunts, uncles, her family, her storgic, the people who love her storgically, may care about her interests. Her best friends, her friends who love her storgically and are willing to incur pain and losses in her behalf so that her interests are served. These people definitely do love her, and I will say that friends don't let friends maunder in self-pity, that she's underfathered and arguably underfriended, given that she's gotten this far. Her friends that have been quoted in the public print seem to be all fairly self-motivated and tendentious anyway. They're all advocates of the idea of rape culture, and so Jackie is useful to them as a totem pole proxy proof of the existence of the so-called rape culture on campus. Rape is a rare crime in circumstances where rape actually occurs. Forcible rape is very, very rare, and of course it's most common in poor neighborhoods. That's where violent crime of every sort happens, is in poor neighborhoods. We're talking about one of the richest college campuses in America, populated overwhelmingly by very, very rich suburban kids. There is no rape culture on college campuses. There is a alcohol culture, a drunk culture that results in mutually drunk people engaging in less than perfectly consensual sex because they have so besotted the thinking brain that they can't think clearly about what they're doing and what the future consequences of their actions will be. The appropriate thing for colleges to do when anybody reports mutually drunk aconsensual sex is immediately charge that person with rape, because if they were both drunk and they had sex, she couldn't have consented to it, but neither could he. Neither one of them could have consented to the sex. And if aconsensual sex in that regard is a crime, then it's a crime committed by both of them against both of them. Charge them both and let them both withdraw the charges. If they're not willing to both withdraw the charges, then go ahead and prosecute them. Throw them out of school. This rape crisis will go away right away. As many people have pointed out, the stupid laws that forbid young people to gain lawful access to alcohol until they're 21, make sure that there are no adults around when they're getting shit-faced drunk, because they can only drink illegally, and therefore no one can take legal responsibility for making sure that they don't get too drunk to manage their behavior responsibly. But I would argue to any one of the 36 people who actually see this movie to have a perspective on the underfathered nature of youth generally, and on the plausible, putative, underfathered life of poor young Jackie, and recognize that she she's been going through hell for at least 13 years, 14 years. And that doesn't absolve her of anything. It doesn't make anything about it right, but it certainly does make it understandable. And to the extent that you want to condemn this kind of outrageous attention-seeking behavior, you should take into account what causes it also, where it originates. I feel sorry for Jackie, I do. I feel sorry for whatever it was she was through in the first place, whatever she went through since then, trying to get tendentious, feminist, Marxist ideologues to pay attention to her, what she went through to improve the story enough to get the writer from Rolling Stone to buy it, and what she's going to go through now that the story is unraveling. I hope that she does have real friends. I hope that she does have family members who really do love her and are willing to embrace her despite all of this. And I hope she gets better. I hope you do too. My name is Greg Swann. This is the Church of Splendor. Thanks so much for spending time with me this morning. I will talk to you next week.